welcome as we look forward now to the 29th Sunday of the church year, or ordinary time as it's called. And the readings are from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 45, verses 1 and then verses 4 and 6. A selection from the letter of St. Paul to the Thessalonians. This will be the first of a few weeks now in which we will be hearing sections from this important letter of St. Paul. We begin with chapter 1, verse 1 through 5. And in the Gospel, we are in chapter 22 of Matthew's story, picking up at verses 15 and going through chapter 21. Now, this really continues from last week. We now find still Jesus in the temple. As you remember, much of the teaching from here on until the end of this liturgical year will be picturing Jesus as doing teaching in the temple area. Today begins the first of 4 conflict stories. Now, once again, in the temple area, along with the people who are doing their kind of business there, are the leaders. Today, we meet the Pharisees and the Herodians in the first of a series of what probably we would call trap stories. They're kind of stories that you present to someone, trying to put them in a disfavorable light or forcing them to answer questions that you know are kind of challenging. It's perhaps an old political ritual. We certainly are more aware of it today in our own time. American politicians regularly use this with their opponents because they ask impossible questions in the front of crowds, therefore hoping that they're going to get a negative or a bad answer. So, for example, if someone assaulted your daughter, here's the question to a politician, would you believe in the death penalty then? So you see, you put it in such a way that it becomes kind of a trap question. Well, that's what we find going on in the temple today, where the Pharisees and the Herodians. Now, this is an interesting connection because the Pharisees, of course, are the teachers, the interpreters of the law, and they are pretty much in the Jewish tradition. The Herodians, whom traditionally the Pharisees would have little to do, work, of course, as much as we know about them, for Herod Antipas. So they would be, the Herodians, would be working really more for the government than they would be for the people, whereas the Pharisees have a tension with the government, and they, of course, are working for the people. So the fact that the Pharisees who resisted the empire are now in a league with those who are supportive of the empire here being Rome, is an interesting situation. So there they are, coming now to Jesus. They have heard him teaching already, as we've heard over the last couple of Sundays. And they begin, which is always a clever way to do things, they begin with a little bit of flattery. They say, we're not sure whether it's a Herodian or a Pharisee who asks the question with Jesus, but they say, look, Jesus, we know that you are an honest and a truthful and a trustful man, that you care little about honor when it comes to the truth, that you are really always ready to be truthful regardless of the consequences. So they really set Jesus up by giving him this praise. Now, do they really mean it? Well, now keep in mind what their mission is. You can believe that it is not. How does it sound with the people who are around when they hear this? Well, maybe they are really honoring Jesus, but it's really a trap question, because now, having set him up, and this is good rhetoric, by the way, and if you're going to carry on a debate, this is probably a good way to do it. You set up your opponent, and then you begin to find ways to knock them down. And that's exactly what the situation is here, because one of them says, and by the way, Jesus, is it lawful to pay the tax or not? So they have kind of put Jesus now in one of those public questions. Public responses will be needed. And it doesn't take much to see where this trap is if you were part of the culture of the time. If Jesus says, pay the tax or the toll, well, then aren't you agreeing with the Roman Empire? And there are many out there who see this as just what we don't want to do anything to support them. But if he says don't pay it, well, then there are spies around who say, see, he's attacking the government, he's a problem maker, we're going to have to do something with him. So it looks to be kind of a clever little trap. You see, everyone knows how these things work. By everyone, I mean not just the questioners, but also by the people in the temple area. And I mention this because, although we haven't looked at this too extensively, and maybe we should in the future, that the temple area was quite large, and there were a lot of people there for all kinds of reasons. And when a popular teacher like Jesus is in the area, you can see that many kind of streamed to where he was to hear what he had to say. And so, therefore, there's an audience here. It isn't just to this little group of questioners that the response is given, but is given to a larger community. Well, now, the specific tax that is, we suspect being inquired about was a poll tax that every citizen from the age of 12 to 65 was expected to pay. And this would generally amount to what we would consider a day's wage. It was a denarius. But still, if you had a family of 7 and each one had to pay that, well, it could be a little bit of the regular budget that had to go in support of a tax which, even after remembering that the Gospel of Matthew was written after the destruction of Jerusalem, the tax was still being taken. So it did not go away simply because the temple was no longer there. So even in Matthew's time, this was a tax that people were aware of. Now, Jesus here, and we will hear is these little trap sessions go on, now responds almost by getting the upper hand, as we see. So he says to the questioners, who has a coin? Now, this is interesting because the coin would have not been a Jewish coin, but would have been a Roman coin, and someone has one. Now, maybe it's a Herodian. It could have been probably an Herodian, and that puts that person in a bad light, because to be carrying a coin of the realm in your pocket in the temple area would have been considered, well, blasphemous in terms of God. Because when we have some artifacts of these coins that appear not only in the 1st century, but even before the common time, and certainly as we move on into the 2nd and 3rd century, archaeologists, these are the kind of things that they tend to discover. So we do have a number of coins, but the coin that we suspect was the one that was in the pocket of this Herodian read this way: Tiberius Caesar, august son of the divine Augustus, high priest. Now that's English. For those of you who like Latin, you can find it in Latin. And that would have been the language in which it was written on the coin. Because after all, this is not a Jewish coin, but is a Roman piece of money. So the Emperor Tiberius, as you remember, was the ruler of the Roman Empire from the year 14 to the year 37. and historically that would have been the emperor of Rome during the time of Jesus' public ministry and also on the occasion of his death and resurrection. So that's a little bit, again, of background about the coin, which now they hand to Jesus. And, of course, Jesus says to the questioner, whose picture is on here? And they say Caesar, and the coin would show that. His picture on one side, usually the writing would be on the reverse side of the coin. And so, very cleverly, Jesus now says, well, look, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and then makes an important addition, but give to God what is God's. And in a certain way now he has thwarted the trap, okay? He has not said anything negative about Rome, but at the same time he has not also said something terribly positive. The coin. Well, give to Caesar what is Caesar. Now, there's much discussion has taken place about this. It would seem that Jesus in his own time probably did not seriously challenge taxation. A couple of stories that we saw, one in Matthew earlier on. Remember the coin and the fish that Peter had gotten there. So the sense that Matthew's community sees is that, yes, we will do what is expected of us. Now, it's important to see here that this is not what later becomes a discussion, particularly even in the Christian church time, namely the issue of separation of church and state. That is not what is going on here. That may be a development that Americans particularly enjoy as we even live in our own times, but that was not something that went on in the first century world. There was not this neat separation between what you believed and the government. It was all simply a composite. So to use this story, as sometimes, preaching has, and not objecting to it, but just saying that was not the purpose or understanding, rather, of this time. Namely, there was an intimate relationship between politics, religion, social practices, cultural practices, economic practices, etc. So, but what is the little trap here about the image? Well, the image, if it is Caesar's image, if you honored that, would be considered adulterous, because you remember that in Jewish tradition and belief, you can create no images, and certainly in an image of God, and if the emperor is pictured here as the divine Son of God, then that would be considered idolatrous to be carrying that coin in your pocket. So there's a lot of little things that go on in this little picture story. Now, there was a group who were very opposed to paying the taxes to Rome. This is a group known as the Zealots, Z-E-A-L-O-T-S, a group technically which was not terribly operative in Jesus' time. We're not quite sure that they were as organized, but later on, that is in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they did begin to form together, and the Zealots were violently opposed to Roman presence. They were responsible for little outbreaks of rebellion, and in the end, in the middle of the 60s, led a movement that caused the Romans to send their troops into the city of Jerusalem, a battle that raged on for almost 5 years, from 65 to 70, and resulted in the destruction of the temple and the fall of Jerusalem. Now, there is in the list of the 12 apostles that Jesus has, one of the apostles is named as Simon the Zealot. Does that mean he belonged to the Zealot party, or could it simply mean he was zealous about certain things, which would, by our standards, probably have been political? So my point is that politics and religion are not as separate as we today would like them to be or think them to be. So if you give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, well, it's his tax and his money, and pay it. But give to God what belongs to God. Now here, of course, it doesn't take a whole lot to see where this argument goes. Where is the image of God to be found? And of course, one goes back to the book of Genesis, where God says, let us create humankind in our image and likeness. So where is the image of God to be found? It's to be found in every human being, even in Caesar. God's image is somewhat to be found. So there's a much more universalism to it. And the Pharisees could only blink their eye and say, he's got us, because we certainly can't object to that. And the Herodians, well, they too were put in their place because Caesar got his coin. Nothing to report back to Herod Antipas that he didn't want to pay the taxes, but at the same time, even included Herod. So there's a kind of beautiful universalism to the response that Jesus gives. There is, and this, of course, would have grown out of Jesus' belief and the belief of the Jewish community of what we call monotheism, that there was one God and only one God. And so in this first attempt to trick Jesus, he really, you can see the community around him hearing this kind of smiled and said, well, he didn't really disagree, but he certainly gave a rather, in a certain way, traditional response, because the teaching of Judaism, where is the image of God? But as we say, in the human person. And that would be an important reminder then, and even an important reminder today. With that in mind, the first reading was chosen from the book of the prophet Isaiah. Mentioned a couple of times that Isaiah is a very popular prophet, particularly used by New Testament writers. But he was also a very important prophet of ancient times or earlier times. In fact, the book of Isaiah has the largest number of chapters of any of the writing prophets. And it is generally believed today that there are 3 sections to the book of Isaiah, or really 3, if you can use this, Isaiah writers. And those of you who are familiar or study a little bit the book of Isaiah will notice that they divided up the first 39 chapters belong to what is called First Isaiah. Chapters 40 to 55 belong to Second Isaiah, and chapters 56 to 66 belong to Third Isaiah. What do they mean by that? Well, the first section is a writing by a prophet named Isaiah before the time of the great exile, the Jewish exile. Remember when they were driven out of their homeland and into Babylon. The second writer writes toward the end of the Babylonian exile. So that would be the time frame in which he writes, and there's a considerable distance between the first Isaiah and second Isaiah. And then the third Isaiah, beginning at chapter 56, wrote after the Israelites had come back to the promised land. So you have what's called the pre-exilic, the exilic, and the post-exilic period. So the reading that we hear this week from chapter 45, therefore, belongs to what is known as Second Isaiah, a writer who is writing close to the end of the period of exile that the Israelites were experiencing. And it has to do, and I mention this because it's interesting, it begins by giving praise to the Emperor Cyrus, or King Cyrus, the king of Persia, who is pictured as being anointed by God to carry out his mission. It's one of the only times in which an outsider, a non-Jew, is chosen or pictured as being chosen by God to carry out an important mission. Most likely, this happened, we'd like to date these things as much as we can, but sometime around the year 538 before the Common Time. What had happened was that Cyrus had defeated the Babylonians, who you remember had led the Israelites into exile. The Babylonians had created an empire, its capital somewhere around modern-day Baghdad, and had been defeated. The king who was defeated there was Nebuchadnezzar. But the Babylonian Empire had already begun to decline. But Cyrus, who, by the way, was not always such a nice guy, he could be kind of a cruel overlord, but nevertheless, when he defeated the Babylonians, created what turned out to be an extremely large empire. Almost all of the Middle Eastern world at that time became part of the Persian Empire and would only be defeated later by Alexander the Great back in 333. But at this point, why this is important and why the writer Isaiah could see Cyrus as the anointed of God. Now remember, the word anointed of God is Messiah, so that in a certain way it's very extraordinary that Cyrus is becoming Messiah, because he reversed the policy of the Babylonians. The Babylonians, you remember, had a policy that when they conquered a people would divide half the people into one group and the remaining group into another group, and then bring in from other places in the Arabian world, would bring in other groups of people, hoping that what would happen over a period of time is that there would be an intermarriage, an intermingling, and that would break down loyalties they had to particular gods and goddesses or particular rulers, and that what you would be doing is creating a unified people. Something like early on, American historians used to talk about the melting pot, that you would bring all cultures together. Of course, in American history, there would be different ethnic groups that principally came from Europe, and that eventually they would discard the language they were going to accustomed to use, rather, and all were going to speak English. So that was kind of the Babylonian idea. Bring them all together, destroy identities, and create a unity. Cyrus reverses this. He says, no, let each of the individual conquered people we have develop their own culture, their own religious practices, their own gods and goddesses. All I want is that they remain loyal to the Persian rule. But Persian rule, therefore, what we would kind of see today is more what America developed on. Let individual groups, particularly religious groups, each exercise their own ways without enforcing one way upon them. And so in that way, you see, he said to the Jewish leaders who were still in exile, when you're ready, right now, you can return to the land that you came from and reestablish the institutions and ways that you were familiar with. So in that sense, you see, Cyrus is seen as being approved by God to do these things and really helping to carry out God's will of allowing the people to come back. And so in the reading that we hear, and all of that is background for why the reading is chosen today, in the reading we hear, the declaration is made that Cyrus, who does not know God, but that Israel does, it's not so much about Cyrus, but about the fact that he does God's will. See, so in a kind of strange way, Cyrus, not knowing it, is doing the very thing that God would want, allowing the Israelite people to return to their homeland, allowing them to now restore some of the things that would be, or rather had been, destroyed at the time of the conquest. So there's a little bit of a background about why this particular section from 2nd Isaiah was chosen. Finally, the second reading comes from the letter of Paul, as I mentioned, to the Thessalonians. We will be hearing for the next 5 weeks from the first letter of the Thessalonians, although what will intervene will be All Saints' Day, so we won't have a reading from there, but traditionally there are 5 weeks. Now, the letter to the First Thessalonians is the oldest extant New Testament writing that we have. Now, probably written somewhere around the year 50 of the Common Time. This does not mean that it is the first of Paul's letters. It only means it's the first of the known letters of Paul that we have. Paul was quite a prolific writer, and so a number of his epistles, for whatever reason, were not preserved historically, but this one was. And Thessalonica, which was the community to which Paul had come after Philippi, so if you look on a map, you'll see that you have coming from the east, that is from Asia. Thessalonica is here, and Philippi is here, but Paul had gone to Philippi first, and then when he got chased out of Philippi for reasons that the Acts talk about, he came to Thessalonica, which was an important city, again, in the Adriatic. It had a wonderful series of ports, therefore it was important for commercial reasons. Has an interesting history, but was named, you might like this, was named after a lady named Thessalonica. And she was the daughter of Philip II of Macedonia. Keep in mind that these cities, although we call them Greek cities, Macedonia was the kind of a situation all of its own, and it was only that Philip II and then his son Alexander III, whom we know as Alexander the Great, found a way to unite the two to create a united Greece. But so there was this kind of tension, somewhat, that I suppose in our country existed between the North and the South during the 1800s on a number of issues. Anyway, Thessalonica was her name. He was a daughter, as I say, and she, of course, had her. If you like trivia, there's a great deal of shenanigans went on politically between the time of Philip II and Alexander the Great. All right, that's a quick little bit of background. Now, just to conclude, the opening of Paul's letter to the Thessalonians represents the typical way in which a letter was written in the old days. It begins by the writer identifying who he is, the addressees to whom it is being sent, and a greeting. So in this case, Paul with Silas and Timothy. Interestingly, that Paul sees although he really writes the letter, includes them as part of the composition. Who are they? Well, he says, to the community of Thessalonians assembled by God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. It's interesting here, Lord Jesus Christ. Jesus refers to the humanity of Jesus, Christ to emphasizes his resurrection, and Lord refers to the believers who see Jesus as God's agent. So in this little opening greeting, the death, resurrection, and profession of the faith of believers is included. And then the greeting, grace to you and peace. So this is the traditional way in which a letter, we may talk about this a little bit more next time, is written. So there's a standard form. Who writes it, who receives it, and a wonderful greeting. So today, that simple little greeting is extended by Paul to the community at Thessalonica, which he had mentioned that he had been part of. So, well, that's a quick little introduction. Perhaps in another time we can look a little bit more at the importance of Thessalonica, not only to Paul, but also to the story of Christianity. Again, thank you for being with us today, and hope to see you next time.